One way Donald Trump is consistent, well, for years he has been branding his enemies or his critics losers and those who kiss the ring as winners. And yet, for someone who's all about winning, there is a striking pattern emerging in many of Trump's picks for positions in his cabinet and administration. We're seeing a whole lot of political losers, people who were defeated in elections in just about every way imaginable. Let's start with Republican Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, or Little Marco, as Trump repeatedly called him, as he wiped the floor with him during the Republican presidential primary back in 2016. Rubio may now enjoy a second act as Trump's new Secretary of State. And then there's Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, the one-time surrogate for Bernie Sanders, who lost the Democratic nomination for president in 2020. Don't forget RFK Jr., who ran against Trump in this year's election as an independent candidate, but dropped out prior to the election. A controversial anti-vaccine activist is now Trump's choice for Secretary of Health and Human Services. It's not just people who've tried to compete with Trump for the White House and failed. Trump has also welcomed figures into the fold who have lost key races for the Republican Party. Mehmet Oz, for example, tapped to be head of Medicare and Medicaid. He lost the Pennsylvania Senate race 2 years ago to John Fetterman. Linda McMahon, Trump's nominee for Secretary of Education. She lost two bids, Senate bids, to Democrats in Connecticut in 2010 and 2012. Lori Chavez DeRemer, who just lost her re-election campaign for a congressional seat in Oregon to Democrat Janelle Bynum. She had already lost 2 times to Bynum prior to that loss. Now, it might seem a little odd for Trump to be choosing so many political losers until we remember who we're actually dealing with here. Trump has repeatedly said that the biggest mistake of his first term was choosing the wrong people. In other words, people who would, at times, push back against his policies. Aides would try to put up guardrails, outmaneuver Trump by slow walking or ignoring directives they saw as ill-advised. Other times, they would mount 11th-hour campaigns to reverse them. Let's remember, for example, in 2020, when Trump wanted to send active duty U.S. troops to respond to mass protests after the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed black man, by a Minneapolis police officer. Well, Trump aides resisted, concerned about the illegal use of the U.S. military against our own citizens. But now some of the current aides and allies tell the Associated Press that Trump is choosing people he believes are fully committed to his America First agenda and those he thinks can best execute it. With these picks for his new administration, Trump is giving new political life to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to get into a presidential administration or cabinet, either due to the impact of their political losses or even in many cases a complete lack of experience. He's seeking out people who need him, and as a result, will be entirely malleable and dependent to his will. All of this allows him to take even more control during his second time in the White House in an attempt to reshape the presidency as we know it. Joining me now to discuss this are Donna Edwards, former Democratic Congresswoman of Maryland, and David Jolly, former Republican Congressman of Florida. They are both MSNBC political analysts. Donna, I want to start with your thoughts on this overarching theme of people who have lost elections, whether to Trump or others, filling up the ranks of his administration. What do you make of the profile of these people?
Well, what I see are a group of people who are, first and foremost, absolutely loyal to Donald Trump. Some of them, like Marco Rubio, or may have started out as critics and competitors, but has quickly fallen into line. The other common thread that I see among these are almost to a one people who deny the 2020 election was won by Joe Biden, and who continued to foment that lie and perception over the last 4 years. And so it really is for Donald Trump, those were tests of loyalty, and it's what he's commanding in his upcoming administration. And they are not going to be people who have too many other options. And so serving at the pleasure of the president is going to be what they will do. And I think that they're just going to fall in line with whatever it is that he chooses.
David, let's zero in on Marco Rubio here for a second. The man Trump has dragged and humiliated so publicly. Now he has been designated as Trump's Secretary of State. What strikes you about that choice and the strategy here? I mean, it's hard to imagine, but that might actually be the most sane pick of Trump's administration so far.
Sure. Yeah, first and foremost, Amen. Marco Rubio hates the United States Senate. He said that publicly in 2016. He's never enjoyed it. And certainly now, under the rise of Trumpism, we saw him have to publicly humiliate himself. And we saw Donald Trump publicly humiliate Marco Rubio. So the opportunity to serve as Secretary of State, something that Marco Rubio is absolutely qualified to do, and he should sail through nomination. For Marco Rubio is a bit of a capstone to his still young career, someone who still has a few decades if he chooses to stay in service. But I think it also reflects kind of what Donna was referring to and your lead in, which is all of these people that Donald Trump has selected have either been tamed, publicly tamed by Donald Trump. Marco Rubio is a good example. RFK Jr. is a good example. The idea of floating Ron DeSantis as Secretary of Defense should Hexeth be withdrawn. All of those people he publicly tamed. He includes that. And then the second group are people who, though they lost in doing his bidding already, right? They were out front in their own campaigns or in their own service, actually trying to be a leader in the MAGA movement, which suggests, as Donna said, that it's loyalty above all else, because we know Donald Trump doesn't like losers, and he doesn't like losing. But I suppose if you're a loser who's loyal, loyalty becomes the preeminent qualification of a Trump pick.
Donna, what do you see as the goal here? I mean, it seems like there's a variety of factors Trump is trying to prioritize, potentially manipulation, control, all in the name of loyalty. But what does the end result actually look like?
Well, look, I think Donald Trump learned a lot in his 4 years. He wants to make sure that he does not have a cabinet of people who might defy him or challenge him or you know, sort of do anything that would go against what he perceives as his personal interests. And so I think you have a group of people, and it's shocking. It's not that presidents haven't chosen people who've lost elections before. Look, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, others, Pete Buttigieg in the Biden administration. It's just that Donald Trump's cabinet is going to be peppered, his administration peppered with people who are losers and loyalists. And if any of them steps out of line, I think that they know what the response will be from Donald Trump, and they're not going to step out of line. They are in lockstep with the president-elect.
David, let's look at Trump's first term here for a moment. He had very little experience in Washington. Took him much longer for him to find his footing. Now he's putting the focus on loyalty with these picks. Do you think there's any chance that Trump's attempts to install pure loyalists will backfire and he will find unexpected resistance from some of these people? I mean, is there anyone? I mean, I think of somebody like a Marco Rubio. Yes, he's been tamed by Donald Trump, but do you think, given the fact that he's more of an institutionalist, came from the Senate, would be, if asked to do something illegal or break the law or something against the conventional wisdom of the U.S. and its norms, stand up to him? Or you're not putting any hope in it?
I'm not. Yeah, I struggle to find anyone in the list of nominees that will stand up to Donald Trump. Right. Rubio might stick out there a little bit, but we've seen what happens. He's already had that test, and he failed it. You can look at Pam Bondi at the Department of Justice. She had that test, but she failed it when she went to Pennsylvania and said the 2020 election was stolen. So what if she is asked if the J6 convicts deserve a pardon? What if she is asked if Donald Trump should have control over who the department prosecutes? Unfortunately, I think what we will see from even the seasoned nominees is a public rationalizing of why Donald Trump is right. Maybe they'll lament it. They'll pull a Susan Collins or a Lisa Murkowski in the Kavanaugh hearings, and we'll see them publicly show angst, but ultimately fall in line. I just think Donald Trump, his second administration, reflects the true ethos of Trump and the MAGA movement. The one opportunity to stand up to Donald Trump is with United States senators during these confirmation hearings. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing the trend among Republicans to once again fall in line.
Yeah, speaking of that confirmation process, Don, I mean, when you look at what's kind of been coming out around somebody like a Pete Hegseth and some of the threats coming out from people like Elon Musk and the warning signs from Tom Tillis, Joni Ernst, do you have any confidence that the Senate might do the right thing, even if they do end up confirming them, that a few of them might stand up and have some backbone and speak up for the interest of these positions, or no?
I don't know. This is a cross your fingers moment, right. I think. Yeah. I don't have a lot of hope. I mean, what I do see, though, is that I think that if Donald Trump and his allies continue to bully senators, I could see how that might actually backfire against somebody like a Murkowski or a Collins in there. But, they appear to be figuring out a way that they can say yes to Donald Trump on some of these nominees. Not really sure about Tulsi Gabbard, not really sure about RFK Jr., but I think Hegseth and some others are probably going to go through, because I think that Republicans will believe that they have to give Donald Trump something.
David, I got to ask you, let me get your final thoughts on this, David. Your biggest concerns about this administration, these cabinet picks, and the fact that these are not people who have proven to have public support.
Yeah, that is kind of a social media cabinet of really unqualified, inexperienced people. And that starts with J.D. Vance. That starts with the pick of our own vice president, who is wholly unqualified to be vice president. And then if you look at the Department of Defense, Treasury, and State, perhaps, a couple of those we know are seasoned and steady hands. But at Defense, it's really worrisome. I think the national security posture of this administration is something that should worry the nation, given how irascible and unpredictable Donald Trump is as a man and as a leader.
And we now have Richard Grenell as the special envoy for special missions, whatever that exactly means. I'm not sure exactly what portfolio that might mean, but one can only take a guess. Donna Edwards, David Jolly, thank you to the both of you. Greatly appreciate it.